The mysterious custodian. It was a dark and stormy night. The wind howled through the empty corridors of the office building. Olivia was on the night shift, lone as always. She was the only one brave, or perhaps foolish enough to work overnight. Thunder roared outside, and lightning lit up the sky. It was the kind of night where strange things happen, and people tell tales they swear are true. Around midnight, as Olivia was typing away at her computer, she heard a faint noise. It sounded like footsteps. She paused, listened, and then shrugged it off. Probably just the wind, she thought. But then she heard it again, louder this time, like heavy boots stomping on the tiled floor. Olivia stood up, her heart racing. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing down the hallway. No answer. She slowly walked towards the source of the noise, her footsteps barely making a sound. As she turned the corner, she saw a shadow move across the wall. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to sound brave. Out stepped the custodian, Mr. O'Reilly, a friendly old man who always had a smile. "Oh, Mr. O'Reilly, you scared me half to death." Olivia laughed, feeling relieved. Mr. O'Reilly chuckled. "Sorry, dear. Just doing my rounds. This storm has the lights flickering, and I thought I should check the generator." Olivia nodded. "Good idea. Let me know if you need any help." Mr. O'Reilly tipped his hat and walked off. Olivia went back to her desk, shaking her head at how jumpy she was. But as she sat down, a thought hit her. Mr. O'Reilly had retired last month. Her eyes widened and a chill ran down her spine. She turned around slowly, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway, the flickering lights, and the distant rumble of thunder.
The Phantom Call. James worked the night shift at a 24-hour call center. It was usually pretty quiet after midnight, but with the storm raging outside, the phones were eerily silent. James leaned back in his chair, trying to stay awake. His eyelids were heavy, and he was about to doze off when the phone rang, startling him. He picked up the receiver. "Customer support, how can I help you?" he said, stifling a yawn. There was a pause on the other end, then a faint, crackling voice. "Help me." James sat up straight, suddenly wide awake. "Hello? Can you hear me? What's your emergency?" "Help me, please." The voice was so faint, it was almost lost in the static. James could barely make out the words, but there was something about the voice that chilled him to the bone. "Where are you? What's your name?" he asked urgently. "Trapped. Can't get out." The voice faded, replaced by the sound of heavy breathing, and then the line went dead. James quickly checked the caller ID, but it showed as unknown. He tried calling the number back. There was no answer. He reported the call to his supervisor, who shrugged it off. "Probably just a prank. Or maybe someone stuck out in the storm," he said. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. He kept replaying the voice in his head. It sounded so desperate, so real. He couldn't just let it go. Later that night, he did some digging and discovered that the call center was built on the site of an old hospital. Rumor had it that many years ago, a patient had gotten trapped in the basement during a fire and never made it out. James shivered, staring at the phone, hoping it wouldn't ring again. But deep down, he knew that if it did, he wouldn't be able to ignore it. Not after what he had heard. The vanishing patient. Tom was a nurse at a small, rural hospital. He was used to working the night shift, but tonight, with the storm raging outside, the hospital seemed even more deserted than usual. Around 3 a.m., Tom was doing his rounds when he noticed something strange. One of the beds in the ICU was empty. He checked the chart at the foot of the bed and frowned. There should have been a patient here, an elderly man named Mr. Johnson, who had been admitted earlier that evening. Tom checked with the other nurses, but none of them had seen Mr. Johnson leave. His personal belongings were still in the room, and there was no record of him being discharged. Feeling uneasy, Tom decided to check the security footage. He watched the tape from the past hour, but there was no sign of Mr. Johnson leaving the room. In fact, there was no sign of him at all. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Tom searched the hospital, checking every room, every closet, every hallway, but there was no trace of Mr. Johnson. It was like he had never been there at all. As Tom was about to give up, he heard a faint voice. "Help me!" He turned around, but there was no one there. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty hallway. "Help me." The voice was closer now, but still faint, like it was coming from far away. Tom followed the voice down the hallway. through a set of double doors and into a storage room. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. Tom spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried the door, but it was locked. "Help me." The voice was right behind him now, so close he could feel the breath on his neck. Tom turned around slowly. There was no one there. Just the empty room, the flickering light, and the storm raging outside. Tom never found out what happened to Mr. Johnson, or who, or what had been calling for help that night. But he knew one thing for sure. He was never working the night shift again.
The elevator incident. Maria worked as a security guard at a high-rise office building. Her job was usually pretty uneventful, but tonight the storm had knocked out the power, and she had to patrol the darkened hallways with only her flashlight for company. Around 2 a.m., she decided to take the elevator up to the 15th floor to check the offices. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button. The doors closed, and she felt the familiar lurch as it started to rise. But then, the lights flickered and the elevator jerked to a halt. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She was stuck. She pressed the emergency button, but there was no response. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging her into darkness. Maria fumbled for her flashlight and turned it on, shining the beam around the small space. She pressed the emergency button again, but still nothing. And then she heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from above her. Tap, tap, tap. "Hello?" Maria called out, shining her flashlight at the ceiling. "Is someone there?" The tapping stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then a soft, whispering voice filled the elevator. "Let me in." Maria's blood ran cold. She backed up against the wall, shining her flashlight frantically. "Who's there? What do you want?" The voice came again, louder this time. "Let me in." Maria's hands were shaking so badly that she almost dropped her flashlight. She pressed herself against the corner of the elevator, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, with a sudden jolt, the elevator started moving again. The lights flickered back on, and the doors opened to the 15th floor. Maria stumbled out, gasping for breath. She never found out who or what was in the elevator with her that night. She never took the elevator again, especially not during a storm. The haunted diner. Lily worked at an all-night diner on the outskirts of town. The place was usually dead after midnight, but tonight, with the storm raging outside, not a single customer had come in. Lily was wiping down the counter when she heard the door chime. She looked up, expecting to see a rain-soaked customer. There was no one there. She shrugged it off and went back to her cleaning. But a few minutes later, the door chimed again. Lily looked up, and again, there was no one there. "Must be the wind," she muttered to herself, trying to ignore the growing unease in her stomach. But then she heard it. A faint, whispering voice coming from the back of the diner. "Lily." Lily froze, her heart skipping a beat. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just the sound of the wind howling outside and the distant rumble of thunder. Lily grabbed a flashlight from under the counter and made her way to the back of the diner. As she stepped into the kitchen, the lights flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. Lily's heart was pounding in her chest as she shined her flashlight around the room. "Lily!" The voice was closer now, almost right next to her. Lily spun around. There was no one there. "Okay, this isn't funny," she shouted, her voice shaking. "Show yourself." Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out, leaving Lily in total darkness. She fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work, but it was no use. And then she felt it, a cold hand on her shoulder. Lily screamed and spun around, but there was no one there. Just the empty kitchen, flickering lights, and the storm raging outside. Lily ran back to the front of the diner, her heart racing. She grabbed her coat and her keys and bolted out the door, not looking back. She never went back to that diner again. And to this day, she still wonders what or who was in the kitchen with her that stormy night. And so, 5 people on the night shift had stories they would never forget. They say the night shift is quiet. Nothing ever happens. But those who work it know the truth. On a dark and stormy night, anything can happen.